The first and one of the most important stages of paleo-anthropology centered on the discovery in 1856 of the famous brainpan or cranium at Neanderthal in Germany. This object was examined in succeeding years by various naturalists. With its considerable dimensions, receding forehead, its enormous orbital ridges and its flattened brain box, the skull presented an extraordinary appearance. Schaffhausen in Germany and Huxley in England declared it the most bestial of all known human skulls and emphasized its simian or gorilla-like characters. According to Schaffenhousen, a marked prominence of the supraorbital region represents the faint vestiges of a primitive type, which is manifested in the most remarkable manner in the Neanderthal cranium, and which must have given the human visage an unusually savage aspect. This aspect might be termed brutal, inasmuch as the prominent supraorbital border is also characteristic of the facial conformation of the large apes. 100 years later, anthropologists had changed their opinion. Neanderthal men, the first true members of Homo sapiens, were not the dim-witted brutes they have been pictured to be. That sentence was written in 1965 in exactly the same book that one of the most famous illustrations in the history of human evolution entered popular culture. It came from Early Man, written by anthropologist Francis Clark Howell, the same book that contained the illustration later nicknamed The March of Progress. 60 years later, the illustration is routinely treated as an icon of an obsolete idea, a simple evolutionary ladder beginning with an ape-like creature and ending inevitably with a modern human. Yet, the surrounding text tells a considerably more complicated story. Once the famous figures are placed back beside their descriptions, something striking emerges. The sequence did not simply portray one species turning into another in a straight line. Its later stages included several human populations that the book explicitly placed within Homo sapiens. Neanderthal man was treated as a genuinely human population, and elsewhere in the same volume, Neanderthals were explicitly called the first true members of Homo sapiens. Cro-Magnon man then occupied the recent end of this spectrum. What now looks like a primitive ladder therefore contains something much more interesting, a mid-century attempt to arrange increasingly modern anatomical grades, including several geographically distinctive populations inside a broad Homo sapiens framework. The misunderstanding begins with the extraordinary success of the illustration itself. The sequence was painted by Rudolf Zallinger for Howell's book and stretched across a fold-out series under the heading The Road to Homo sapiens. Once detached from its explanatory material, the figures became almost irresistible as a symbol. Small, ape-like ancestors at one end gradually become taller, straighter, and increasingly human, until Cro-Magnon and modern people appear at the other. Reproduced without the geological timeline and accompanying descriptions, it looks exactly like a single-file evolutionary parade. Countless later cartoons intensified that impression by reducing the sequence to 5 or 6 silhouettes and stripping away nearly every qualification. The result became more famous than the original. Evolution appeared to proceed through a succession of neatly defined creatures, each replacing its predecessor, with one lineage steadily marching toward us. Yet Howell's introductory text immediately complicated that interpretation. It explained that breaks in the colored ribbons indicated extinction or gaps in fossil knowledge. Different evolutionary branches overlapped in time. Paranthropus was explicitly identified as an evolutionary dead end. Several forms existed alongside one another rather than occupying consecutive steps. The artwork certainly reflected the evolutionary thinking of its era, and much of its taxonomy and chronology is now obsolete. But it was never quite the simple ladder that later reproductions made it appear to be. This distinction becomes especially important once the sequence reaches the later humans. The popular caricature encourages us to imagine a procession from primitive creature to Homo erectus, from Homo erectus to Neanderthal, from Neanderthal to Cro-Magnon, and finally from Cro-Magnon to ourselves. The accompanying descriptions tell a different story. They increasingly shift from distant ancestors toward populations treated as variants within humanity itself. In other words, the road toward recent humanity already contained a broad conception of our species. A heavily built African skull that many 21st century classifications position outside Homo sapiens was being described 60 years ago as an extinct human race within it. Then comes Neanderthal man, and here the contrast between modern memory and the actual 1965 wording becomes even stronger. The accompanying description begins by rejecting the brutish stereotype. Neanderthals, it says, were not nearly as brutish as their name had come to imply. Their populations occupied large areas around the Mediterranean and across Europe. Their cranial capacity sometimes exceeded that of modern people, and their stone technology was advanced in design. Elsewhere, the book goes further with the remarkable statement that opens this discussion. Neanderthal men, the first true members of Homo sapiens. The wording is unmistakable. This was not written after ancient DNA demonstrated interbreeding between Neanderthals and other human populations. It was not a reinterpretation produced after the Neanderthal genome appeared in 2010. It came from 1965, when the genetic revolution in paleo-anthropology was still far in the future. The authors were working primarily from bones, archaeology, comparative anatomy, and the intellectual traditions of 20th century physical anthropology, yet they were entirely comfortable placing Neanderthals within a broad Homo sapiens category. That classification was not an eccentric invention. The scientific status of Neanderthals had been debated from almost the moment their fossils became accepted as ancient humans. One tradition classified them as a distinct species, Homo neanderthalensis. Another classified them as a subspecies, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, with recent humans correspondingly designated Homo sapiens sapiens. The difference carried substantial evolutionary implications. A species-level classification emphasized evolutionary distinction, while a subspecies classification allowed Neanderthals to represent a geographically differentiated branch within a wider human species. Neither position could be settled merely by measuring cranial capacity or brow ridges, because species boundaries among fossil populations are theoretical interpretations, rather than labels embedded in the bones themselves. By the middle 20th century, therefore, the proposition that Neanderthals belonged inside Homo sapiens was already well established. What ancient DNA eventually transformed was not the existence of that idea, but the quantity and quality of information available for testing relationships among these populations. The Cro-Magnon description pushes the 1965 framework even closer to recent humanity. Cro-Magnon man was described as only a cultural step away from modern people, associated with cave painting, engraving, and carved imagery. The text also stated that Cro-Magnon people replaced Neanderthals in Europe and subsequently diversified into populations that spread widely. That replacement model reflects the scientific assumptions of the period and requires substantial qualification today. Genetics has demonstrated that Neanderthals did not simply disappear without biological contribution to later populations. People whose primary ancestry traces to populations outside sub-Saharan Africa commonly carry roughly 2% Neanderthal ancestry, while ancient genomes reveal repeated interaction between Neanderthals and other human populations. Some early modern individuals possessed Neanderthal ancestors only a few generations back. Replacement occurred demographically across much of Eurasia, but it was accompanied by interbreeding. The boundary between the departing Neanderthal populations and incoming populations was therefore biologically permeable. This creates an intriguing reversal. In one respect, the 1965 framework looks extremely old-fashioned. It employed racial terminology that anthropology has largely abandoned for these fossil groups, reconstructed evolutionary relationships that later discoveries altered, and presented human evolution with a visual directionality that modern evolutionary biology treats cautiously. Yet, in another respect, its broad Homo sapiens framework looks unexpectedly compatible with questions that genetics has forced back into scientific discussion. Neanderthals and recent humans produced fertile descendants whose DNA survives in people today. Denisovans, unknown as a distinct archaic population in 1965, also exchanged genes with ancestors of people alive today. Genetic analysis has uncovered repeated episodes of contact among populations once pictured as isolated branches. The evolutionary history of humanity increasingly resembles a network of divergence, geographical isolation, expansion, renewed contact and genetic exchange rather than a clean succession of sealed species. That does not prove that every archaic population should formally be classified as Homo sapiens. Taxonomy and ancestry are different questions, and interbreeding alone does not automatically settle species status. Closely related animal species can exchange genes while retaining distinct evolutionary identities. Neanderthals also possessed a recognizable anatomical pattern that developed across hundreds of thousands of years, especially in Europe and Western Eurasia. Their elongated crania, powerful brow region, projecting midface, large nasal anatomy, robust skeleton, and distinctive dental characteristics form a coherent evolutionary pattern rather than random variation within a single local community. Genetic data likewise demonstrate prolonged differentiation between the ancestors of Neanderthals and those of many later modern populations. Calling Neanderthals Homo sapiens neanderthalensis therefore represents one defensible taxonomic interpretation, while Homo neanderthalensis represents another. The important historical point is narrower and stronger. Treating Neanderthals as a branch within Homo sapiens is not a radical reinterpretation invented after the genomic era. Scientists were explicitly publishing that classification in widely distributed literature 60 years ago. The 1965 sequence also reveals why the concept of anatomical grades once carried so much weight. Without genomes, researchers confronted fossils that frequently combined characteristics in ways that resisted tidy categories. Neanderthals possessed unmistakably distinctive skull anatomy, but brain volumes fully within and frequently above the recent human range. Cro-Magnon fossils looked much closer to people alive today, although they too possessed robust skeletal characteristics. Arranging these populations according to anatomical grade provided one way of making sense of that mosaic. The arrangement could easily be mistaken for direct ancestry, particularly when converted into a procession of walking figures, but anatomical similarity does not demonstrate that one pictured population literally transformed into the next. The historical irony becomes even sharper when we jump forward to 1988. Newspaper coverage surrounding the growing out of Africa debate described a scientific landscape undergoing another major rearrangement. Mitochondrial DNA research was being interpreted as evidence for a comparatively recent African origin of recent humans, while fossils from the Levant complicated any simple geographical narrative. Reporting on the Schaffhausen fossils emphasized anatomically modern people in the eastern Mediterranean far earlier than the classic Cro-Magnon populations of Europe. One contemporary headline announced that Cro-Magnon man is a long-lost ancestor, while the article discussed the possibility that populations represented at Schaffhausen were connected to later modern people. Out of Africa, theorists increasingly argued that Neanderthals represented a distinct lineage replaced by expanding modern populations. The intellectual pendulum was moving away from some broader mid-century concepts of Homo sapiens and toward models emphasizing deeper differentiation between Neanderthals and recent modern humans. Then genetics complicated the picture again. The first strong genomic evidence of Neanderthal contribution to living populations demonstrated that replacement had never been absolute. Denisovan DNA subsequently revealed another archaic population that had exchanged genes with ancestors of living humans. Ancient genomes from individual fossils transformed abstract population diagrams into actual family histories. Some ancient people carried unusually long stretches of Neanderthal DNA, indicating extremely recent Neanderthal ancestry. The sharp boundary between them and us became harder to maintain as a simple biological narrative. Distinct populations certainly existed. Long periods of isolation certainly occurred. Major anatomical differences were real, yet those populations encountered one another and had children, and some of those children became ancestors of later people. Human evolution contained branches, but branches sometimes reconnected. Seen from that perspective, the march of progress becomes far more interesting than the parody it eventually inspired. Its scientific errors are genuine, but the image has acquired an additional error imposed by later culture. We turned a complicated fold-out into a simplistic claim that its creators never quite made. The original pages explicitly acknowledged evolutionary dead ends, overlapping populations, gaps in fossil knowledge and reconstructions based upon limited skeletal material. Most importantly, the later figures were not all described as different species marching toward Homo sapiens. Neanderthals were described as the first true members of Homo sapiens. Cro-Magnon represented a still more recent human form. Whatever we think of those classifications today, the conceptual landscape of 1965 was therefore far richer than the familiar silhouette suggests. And that changes the historical question. Instead of asking why scientists 60 years ago believed in a crude ladder from ape to modern human, we should ask why the subtleties surrounding that famous image disappeared from memory. Part of the answer lies in the power of pictures. 11 or 12 walking figures can travel across generations far more easily than several pages of qualification. Remove the timeline, captions, branching ribbons, and explanatory text, and the illustration becomes something else. The parody eventually replaces the original argument. A complicated depiction of evolutionary grades becomes a staircase. A taxonomic debate becomes a succession of species. Neanderthal becomes the creature immediately before us, rather than a geographically distinctive human population whose relationship with other humans was already being debated. 60 years later, ancient DNA has given us information that Howell and his contemporaries could scarcely have imagined. Yet it has also returned us to a question they clearly recognized. How different can two ancient human populations become while still belonging within a broader biological community capable of exchanging genes? Where should taxonomy divide a continuum of divergence and contact into named species? And when we place Neanderthals, Denisovans, Middle Pleistocene Africans, Asian archaic populations, and recent humans into neatly labeled boxes, are those boxes describing nature itself, or simply giving us a practical vocabulary for a much less orderly evolutionary history? The terminology of 1965 cannot simply be transplanted into modern paleo-anthropology, but neither can its ideas be dismissed as primitive science. The words on those old pages are surprisingly explicit. Neanderthals, as members of Homo sapiens, archaic populations interpreted as extinct human groups, and Cro-Magnon people positioned near the recent end of a broad spectrum were already part of the discussion. Perhaps that is the real lesson hidden inside the march of progress. Scientific history rarely advances in the clean procession depicted by its most famous image. Ideas disappear, return under different terminology, acquire new evidence, and sometimes become complicated by discoveries that neither side of an earlier argument anticipated. The Neanderthal genome did not create the idea that Neanderthals belonged within a broader humanity. Long before anyone could extract ancient DNA from a Neanderthal bone, researchers had already argued exactly that from anatomy and archaeology. Genetics then supplied an entirely new dimension to an old debate, confirming biological connections while simultaneously demonstrating deep population structure. The truth known 60 years ago was not that every detail had already been solved. It was that human evolution was more complicated than a line of figures walking from primitive to modern, and that Neanderthals could be understood not simply as something before us, but as one ancient expression of humanity itself. Thank you for watching. If there is one thought worth carrying away from these 60-year-old pages, it is that the history of human origins often becomes simpler in memory than it ever was in science.